Good morning. We've had a pretty crazy week this week, looking at the major Cold War events of the 1940s and the 1950s. Today I'd like to look with you very quickly at some of the major events that took place in the Cold War in the 1960s. A couple things are continuing. The war in Vietnam continues throughout the 1960s. The Vietnam conflict, the Vietnam War, is going to continue all the way into 1975. So we'll actually look at that tomorrow after your test. But realize that the war in Vietnam is continuing throughout the entire decade, and the war is actually escalating. In the 1960s, we invest more men, more women, more material, more money into Southeast Asia. China, the USSR invests more. It's still not an open war between the United States and the Soviet Union. It continues to be a proxy war, a limited war, but the war definitely escalated. Something else that continued throughout the 1960s was the space race. The space race escalated into who could put a man into orbit, who could put a person into orbit, who could reach the moon first. The Soviet Union was the first country to put a man into space. And then we were the first one to actually put a person on the moon first. Again, the space race is going to continue into the 1970s as well. We'll look at that again tomorrow. Something else that continues in the 1960s is the arms race, or the nuclear arms race. Both countries, just like we talked about during World War I, both countries are trying to have a stronger military than the other side. There's some new events that we need to look at in the 1960s, though, however. Probably the most famous one goes back to Cuba. See, in 1959, Cuba, the leader in Cuba, was overthrown in a military coup, and basically kind of with the assistance of the United States. And unbeknownst to Americans, the person that led the coup was a communist. His name was Fidel Castro. So here, the island of Cuba, just 60 miles south of Florida, in 1959 becomes a communist country. Well, in the early 1960s, the United States attempted to overthrow the leader of Cuba by using Cuban refugees to start a civil war in Cuba. It was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a failure, but it did give the Soviet Union the opportunity to do what they would say is to protect Cuba. One of the ways they acted to protect Cuba was to start building nuclear missile sites in Cuba that could hit any country, almost any country in North America and South America. While the Soviet Union was building these missile sites, they were discovered by the United States as we were flying U-2 airplanes over Cuba, the spy planes. And when we discovered these missiles, we addressed it directly to the Soviet Union. That happened in 1963, and it's known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's probably the closest the United States and the Soviet Union ever went to war. I wish we had more time to to go into more details, because there's definitely more things going on in the Cold War in the 1960s than just these items I quickly discussed with you. But that's all the time we have today. I really do want you to start feeling comfortable with what took place in the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War was a very controversial war here in the United States. So for the remainder of the time, and then tomorrow after we take the weekly test, we're going to watch this documentary about what took place in Vietnam. I'll be back tomorrow, and make sure you have your homework finished. It should be on my desk. Make sure you're prepared for tomorrow's test. Enjoy the video.